Chapter 33, Full-Fledged. Within the same week prior to when I paroled, I found out that Sophie had been placed back in custody due to the district attorney asking that her bail be revoked. Because of the seriousness of the case, her bail was jacked up and she was rearrested with new amended charges. According to what Sophie would later tell me, she had no idea that they were planning on doing this to her. On the day she was arrested, she was coming from Melissa's apartment when the cops swooped up on them and took her to jail. She was obviously upset when I finally talked to her on the phone later at Bobby's house. I stayed in touch with her while I was out, kept money on her books, and even visited her at the county jail. During my few months in Corcoran, I also began corresponding with Vicky on a regular basis. The letters eventually became more frequent and more personal. Wormy would occasionally have her send me pictures, and she continued to facilitate all my communications with Cornell. He was aware of the fact that we stayed in touch. However, this was supposed to be strictly on a business level. But as Vicky began opening up to me, she began telling me things about Wormy that really upset me. She explained how Wormy would go on his tirades, accusing her of having an affair with me when I was out. He even went as far as to say that I wasn't man enough to be upfront with him about it when I was living in Ukiah. The truth was that I never crossed that line in the past, but I was starting to grow tired of hearing about how he repeatedly assassinated my character. And he was the one who wasn't man enough to confront me about his ridiculous suspicions. I even started hearing things he apparently said about me from homeboys from Santa Rosa, so I knew this wasn't Vicky trying to play us against each other. She was supposed to be his lady, so it was his place to push the issue. Truthfully, this drove a wedge between our friendship, and I now no longer gave him that respect. At one time, he was my boy and I held him in high regard, but he obviously didn't have that same respect for me. From that point on, as far as I was concerned, all bets were off. Vicky and I continued riding each other all the way up until I paroled. We even took it as far as making plans for her to come out and see me the same day I got out. When I paroled back to Salinas this time, my parole officer, Tim Work, put me up in another halfway house off of Market and Sun Street. This place was the lick. There were two houses side by side that housed about 8 other parolees. Like the previous halfway house they put me in out in the marina, this one was also managed by an ex-parolee. And this fool was as dirty and as crooked as they come. He was an older Cuban guy named Nelson Garces. I knew this spot was going to be cool as soon as I knocked on his door to give him the parole voucher. When he opened up the door, he was standing there holding a bottle of Patron tequila, shit-faced, with beer bottles everywhere. Within an hour of sitting there and talking to him, I knew his whole get down. He was managing these two houses for the owner, but overcharging parole for the vouchers and pocketing the money. He was also into identity theft and working stolen credit cards. This fool had his hands in a lot of shit. He was scandalous. All he did was kick back at that house, drink, and work credit cards and stolen checks. This place was off the hook, but it didn't get no better than this. When we were sitting in his living room, a female friend of his, who he called Misty, stopped by and brought another bottle of Patron. This broad was a straight hoe, and she wasn't ashamed to admit it. She had no shame about herself at all. After telling her that I had just gotten out and was going to be staying there, she started strip dancing around the living room until she was butt-ass naked. At one point, she even jumped on the couch, stood over me, and tried putting her ass in my face. This broad was crazy, but I just pushed her away and kept talking to Nelson. Even though I just got out and had yet to get my rocks off, there was nothing about this broad that appealed to me. Nelson just sat there the whole time, laughing and coaxing her on. Later on, I'd find out that she was a bona fide street whore, but always made herself readily available to any one of the parolees that lived there. This house was one of her spots. She was also Nelson's puppet. After I left Nelson's room, I walked down the street to buy a beer and jumped on the payphone. First, I called my mom and stepfather to let them know that I was out and to see how they were doing. Even though I was getting bounced around from county to county and couldn't see them as much as I would have liked, we still stayed in constant contact, and they always came up to visit me. Next, I called Vicky. I knew she was probably out in Salinas somewhere, and I honestly couldn't wait to see her. When she answered the phone, I said, "Where you at?" She said, I'm at a motel called the Vagabond somewhere off a street called Market. Where you at? I said, I'm just a couple blocks away. I'll be over there right now. She said, Audrey wants to know if you can bring her a 6-pack of Jack's Hard Lemonade. Audrey was one of Vicky's best friends that I met when I was still living in Ukiah. Once our letters had become more personal, Vicky had me mail my letters to Audrey's house so she could pick them up without Wormy finding out. Coincidentally, the Vagabond Motel just happened to be down the street from where I was staying and only took me about 10 minutes to walk there. When I got to the hotel, Vicky and Audrey were sitting in the room talking and listening to oldies. Audrey had checked into another room and left as soon as I got there. Even though Audrey was aware of everything that was going on, I still felt a little awkward at first for the fact that she knew Wormy and I both. Honestly, I felt like I was the one being scandalous since Wormy was my boy, and I was. But at that point, it didn't even matter anymore, and I tried not letting it bother me. Needless to say, I spent the night with Vicky, squarely sealing the fact that mine and Wormy's friendship would never again be the same. In retrospect, I accept full responsibility for my part in what happened and knew I could have handled things differently. But the reality of it was that at the same time, Wormy's actions and the things he did also contributed to it. After the first night with Vicky, I knew everything was about to get a lot more complicated. It wasn't just going to end with that one night and somebody was about to get hurt. Even though I had now crossed that line and slept with Vicky, I never pushed her to leave Wormy. I left that completely up to her. When she left the following day for Ukiah, I called Bobby and had him drive by and swoop me up. We drove back to his house where he told me that Sophie had her lawyer drop off boxes of transcripts for me and him to read. She wanted me to read everything so I could see with my own 2 eyes that she wasn't ratting like everybody else assumed she was. Nobody had any proof that Sophie was cooperating with law enforcement, yet filters were still being circulated to stay away from her and not to have any dealings with her. My guess was that Smiley and Lobo were the ones putting this out there and that it was all personal. Despite being aware of these filters, I didn't turn my back on her and continued to be there for her during the whole time she was locked up fighting her case. The truth was that Sophie never cooperated with law enforcement and was probably the only one in that case that didn't. Everybody else rolled over. She was the only female that got wrapped up in this case, and she was the only one who didn't make any statements. I read every single piece of discovery Bobby had of hers, and there was nothing I saw that indicated she had ever agreed to talk to anybody. Had she cooperated in that case, she probably would have gotten cut loose. But unfortunately for her, she had become so consumed with proving everyone else wrong that she held her mud and took 18 years on the chin. For a female, let alone for a female that had never done time before, this must have seemed like a lifetime. But she hunkered down, signed custody of her 5 kids over to her mom, and took the 18-year deal. While still at Bobby's, I called Smokey and Wino and told them both that I was out. Bubba was back in on a short violation, but Gabe, Cornnut, Shorty, and Animal were all still out there. When I got Smokey on the phone and told him where parole had me staying, he said to have Bobby drop me back off over there, and he'd meet up with me to drop some stuff off. He brought a TV, a small refrigerator, blankets, sheets, towels, and everything else I needed. After I got myself settled in, one of the first things Smokey and I did was to get in touch with my homeboy Chewy from Frisco. Chewy and I had made plans to link up while we were still in Quinton, and he told me he'd plug me in with some of his resources. Chewy was working with another one of my homeboys named Mo Salazar from Presida Park, and together they were moving a lot of weight out there. When I finally got a hold of Chewy, he told me to drive out with Smokey so we could all meet up and discuss how we were going to start doing business together. The next day, we made the drive out there and met up with Chewy and Mo at a small bar in downtown San Francisco. As soon as we got there, they both handed me $500 each to help me get on my feet, and then Chewy handed me 4 ounces of crystal. He told me that it was strictly on the strength to get us started and that we didn't owe him nothing for it. Mo told me that once I dumped it in Salinas, they were going to love it, and after that I could start getting pounds for $4,500. This was love because at the time, the average price was between $7,500 and $9,000. This was crystal meth, it wasn't crank, and I could tell by looking at it that it was good dope. Mo also told us that he could put us on with crack cocaine if we had a market for it out there too. He said he'd give us ounces for $4.50 and that he was cooking it up himself. I personally never dealt with crack and didn't really care for the clientele, but Smokey said he could dump it in Chinatown and knew a couple youngsters who would sling it for us. I told Mo that we'd get something the next time we drove out there, and it just started us out with 4 ounces to see how it went. Over the next couple weeks, Smokey and I ran around Salinas, focusing our attention on trying to reestablish Chinatown and tapping into new resources. We ran together on a daily basis. I had been through Chinatown and knew where it was at, but didn't know anything about the tracks until Smokey took me out there and showed me. The tracks were located on the other side of Chinatown and were where a lot of dope fiends went to fix their dope or score heroin. There were street dealers who sold heroin in Chinatown, but there were also dealers who used to roam the tracks and sling their shit out there too. To the average person who lived in Salinas, they had probably driven by this area hundreds of times and probably had no idea what was happening there. The tracks were a secluded area of railroad tracks that could only be accessed by physically climbing through a hole in a chain link fence. A cluster of bushes and trees offered a sanctuary to this secret society and made it nearly invisible to the cops. However, the cops were well aware of what took place back there and occasionally would come through and conduct small parole sweeps. As soon as we walked back there, I knew this was a hot spot. It was obvious that Smokey and I stood out. We were both fitted up and just looked like we were out of our element. But this was an area that had to be established, and this was part of the grunt work. Our plan was to get some of these dealers to start working for us and to basically flush anyone out that wasn't slinging our product. We had crack, crystal, and heroin, and this was territory that needed to be established as ours. At that time, there was only one other dealer back there who went by the name Greñas. Even though he was only pushing small amounts of heroin, we let him know that he was either going to start paying $100 in kickbacks, distribution rights, a week, or he wasn't going to be allowed to sell his dope in that area. Greñas was an older paisa who was probably slinging to support his own habit, but he gave up no resistance and agreed to start kicking in once a week. We also propositioned some of the other paisas that Smokey knew to start working for us. That same day, we put 5 of them in pocket. These dudes all looked like they had just climbed from up under a rock and were definitely dope fiends, but Smokey knew them and said they were good runners. They knew everybody and practically lived back there. After we left the tracks, we drove back through Chinatown trying to find more paisas that would work for us on the streets and move the crack. This was another area we had to establish as ours, but out there, it was a little more of a challenge. Aside from the paisas that were out there, there was also a mix of blacks, white guys, northerners, and even a couple of females who were all freelancing small amounts of crack, heroin, and cocaine. The northerners weren't a problem, but some of these other individuals tried testing the waters in the beginning until we literally had to start smacking some of these fools around and running them out of there. The first 2 weeks were the busiest 2 weeks we had, and they were the riskiest. Between the tracks in Chinatown, we literally had to wrangle up some of these extortion payments. But this was an essential part of establishing the regiment, as the NF's main source of revenue is the sale of drugs and taxation of drug dealers. We had to keep jumping out on some of these paisas because they either didn't want to pay or thought they'd get away with trying to avoid us when we go in to collect. But the resistance was minute, localized, and easily crushed. Whenever civility was ineffective, violence was always the neutralizer. On one occasion, we picked up one of our runners in Chinatown who said he had a customer who wanted an ounce. He asked us to drive him to some apartments on Sun and East Market, directly around the corner from where I was staying. When we got there, Smokey handed him the ounce and we watched him walk in through the front door and go inside. About 20 minutes later, he came back out and we took off. As we were driving him back to Chinatown, he began shuffling around in the back seat, going through all the pockets of his big, filthy-ass parka jacket, obviously acting like he was looking for the money. Smokey told him in Spanish, "You better quit fucking around and find that shit." The paisa told us he thought he left it at the apartment and played with us to take him back. We drove him back and again waited in the car while he went back inside the apartment to get the money. After waiting for about 20 minutes and believing this fool was playing games, Smokey says, "Let's go in there and get this fool." When we got to the door, Smokey knocks on the door and an older paisa opened up the door. As soon as he opened up the door, we pushed our way inside and we could see the other paisa sitting on the bed. These apartments were like small studios, literally just one small rundown room, and from the condition of the room, it was obviously a dope spot where dope fiends would go to use their dope. There was nothing in there but a bed and a couple small dressers. When we got inside, I closed the door behind me and Smokey started telling this guy in Spanish that this was his last chance to come up with the money. The paisa claimed that the broad who bought the ounce must have forgot to give him the money and that he'd have it for us by that night. Unfortunately for him, that wasn't an option. How do you do a transaction and forget about the money? My guess is that he probably got distracted smoking the pipe and getting high while they were all in there, if he was even telling the truth. I honestly thought he was because I didn't think he was that crazy to put himself in this situation. But either way, he didn't have the money and that's all that mattered. After running out of patience, Smokey started bombing on him. Then he started opening up all the drawers looking for a knife or something sharp to stab him with. Literally, after looking through every drawer in the room, Smokey grabbed an edger that was leaning up against the wall behind the door. A garden tool with a small spike wheel at the end of a handle used to edge lawns, and began hitting him with it. The paisa started crying and jumped up on top of the bed, trying to deflect some of the blows with his arm until Smokey finally broke the handle. When the handle broke, he took his jacket off and started bashing on this dude until he got tired. Then I took my turn until I got tired, and I took all face and head shots. When I finally stopped wailing on him, we pinned him down and continued to beat him until his face was literally unrecognizable. The other paisa just sat there the entire time and didn't say a word. When we were done, we drove this guy back out to the car by the legs of his pants and threw him in the trunk. As we drove him back to Chinatown, Smokey talked to him while he was still in the trunk and told him that he had until the end of the night to get the money. Otherwise, the next time we dropped him off, it was going to be in the middle of a salad field. When we got back to Chinatown, we pulled over and dumped him off in the middle of the street. This incident alone put a lot of fear into the other paisas, and that was the last time we had to rough anybody else up out there in Chinatown. Every Friday after that, we drove down there and all the paisas would run up to the car and pay us their weekly distribution rights. This is when we finally started generating money and reestablished Chinatown under NF control. Meanwhile, Smokey and I got word through a female named Carol Huerta, who was involved with NF General Joseph Pinky Hernandez, that they wanted us to arrange a visit and either pull out Pinky, Corny, or Skip, who at the time were all housed at the Santa Rita County Jail. That same weekend, we drove a female visitor out there and had her visit Corny. The first visit was basically just to touch base and to advise us that they wanted us to find a reliable visitor who could pull him out weekly. Corny also sent us directives to contact Charlie Campa in San Jose to meet with him for business-related purposes. That's all that was said. Later that same day, I called Charlie and explained my purpose for contacting him. Charlie told me that he was in possession of some CDs that Brass wanted Smokey and I to hear with our own ears, and if it was possible to drive out there the following day. The next day, Charlie gave us instructions to meet him at a hotel somewhere off the freeway in South San Jose. When we got there, Charlie, NR member Chris Chino Clip from Mountain View, and another NR member named Isaac Gato Marquez were all there waiting for us. The whole purpose behind Corny wanting us to go down there was to listen to some CDs of Robert Chico Rose from Salinas that had been disseminated through their court discovery. Discovery is when the district attorney releases all the evidence, including witness statements, interviews, videos, and any other type of tangible evidence the DA intends to use to prove their case. The CDs contained all the interviews Chico had with the federal agents and the full debrief he provided prior to defecting. Apparently, Chico decided to cooperate as soon as he was apprehended. These interviews were kept under seal, so nobody knew nothing about him flipping until months later. He basically continued to function while he was still in Santa Rita, as if he was still on the team. But when it came time to release the discovery, they placed him under federal protection. I remember there were 4 CDs in total, but after listening to the first 2, I told Charlie that I had heard enough. It wasn't necessary to listen to them all unless there was something that specifically pertained to me that I needed to know about. I just didn't want to hear it. Chico was my boy, and it was difficult listening to him under those circumstances. I didn't want to believe it either, but I was still active, so in my mind, on that day, I felt like I was witnessing his demise and knew I had to cut my ties with him. A couple of days after we met Charlie, Lencho called Smokey and told him that he had just gotten out and wanted us to drive out to San Jose and kick it with him. He wanted us to meet him that night at a bar called The Place on the West Side. This was Lencho's spot. He had everybody who frequented this bar licking his nuts, pampering him like he was some type of living legend. Even the bartenders and the owner embraced this cat. It wasn't because Lencho was an intimidating presence in his own right, or that he had a knack for attaining influence on his own. It was because he hid behind the title of the NF and openly boasted that he was solely in charge of the entire San Jose area. That's what put fear into people, flaunting his status and knowing that he had that type of power. As I would get to know him more over the years, I'd come to notice that he actually did this more in front of women than he did in front of the homeboys. And this was his game. He used it to entice them. When Smokey and I drove out to San Jose that night, we met Lencho and one of his homeboys, NR member David Pookie Bermudez, down the street from the place. The first thing I noticed when I got out of the car and looked at Lencho was a long, deep scratch that extended all the way down from under his right eye to the side of his chin. When I asked him what happened, he told me that when he was in Salinas Valley, an NLR, Nazi lowrider, one of the NF's fiercest enemies and, similar to the Aryan Brotherhood, was composed of neo-Nazi believers, had popped his door open and rushed him with a dull razor while being escorted in chains. Later, I find out the true story and what really happened. It would also become obvious why Lencho had lied about it too. Apparently, while Lencho was in Salinas Valley, he was placed in a housing area next to an individual by the name of Eddie Fast Eddie Ibarra. Fast Eddie was one of the original founders of a dropout clique called New Flowers and had a notorious reputation for being a hitter. Eddie wasn't a punk and had actually put his own crew together on the streets that targeted active homeboys. He was one of the NF's biggest targets and one who had to be approached with caution. Lencho was well aware of this. While they were there, Fast Eddie befriended Lencho and pulled his dummy card. He sent Lencho cosmetics, reading material, coffee, and all the other necessities that you would normally send someone when they first came in. This is a lockdown unit, ADSEG, with single cells, so you never came into physical contact with any of the other inmates. But on the day of Lencho's release, Lencho came out of his cell intending to return Fast Eddie's magazines when Fast Eddie called him to the door. The doors are solid steel with a rectangular window in the center, but one can still slide books under the bottom, and the cracks along the sides are usually only wide enough to slide a thin magazine through. At times, it's difficult to hear someone when they're talking on the other side of a steel door, so by habit, you'd instinctively lean in closer to the door to hear better. Knowing that Lencho was due to parole that day, Fast Eddie fastened a loosened razor at the end of a rolled up piece of paper, just thin enough to stick through the crack on the side of the door. And then he waited. Like a dummy, Lencho took the bait and lost all sense of his schooling by leaning into the crack so he could hear what Fast Eddie was trying to tell him. That's when Fast Eddie pushed his little contraption through the crack and sliced Lencho. Luckily for Lencho, the razor was dull. Otherwise, he would have got him better. Lencho lied about this because he was embarrassed to admit how stupid he was, on top of who the perpetrator was. That night when Smokey, Lencho, Pookie, and I were at the place, things almost went bad real fast. This was the first time I'd ever been there, but over the years, I had always heard stories about it from different homeboys that I'd run into in prison from San Jose. It's almost exclusively all homeboys and homegirls, and damn near everyone in there is either on probation or parole. There are two entrances to use, depending on what street you're coming in from, and it's usually packed. The night we were in there, San Jose PD came in from both sides and started carding everyone. I slipped into the bathroom before they saw me. They ended up pulling Smokey out and had him jacked up outside for about 20 minutes while they ran his name, trying to figure out why he was there if he was on parole in Salinas. Technically, they could have violated him based on the fact he was outside of his 50-mile radius. But Smokey fed them some sad story about a relative passing away and they let him go. As soon as they left, we jumped on the freeway and headed straight back to Salinas. It was just too close of a call and we were both out of bounds. Over the next couple weeks, Vicky would end up coming out and staying with me for a few days at a time, but eventually it got to the point where it wasn't just enough. She didn't want to leave and I didn't want to see her go. At the same time, things had completely fallen apart between her and Wormy, and he ended up moving out. Her dad, Sterling, moved in after Wormy left and was now living there with their son, Rudy. Rudy was now almost 18 years old and had been talking about getting his own place, so Vicky decided to move out with me. I was still at that halfway house and could have moved, but by then I damn near ran that place single-handedly and had moved into a room that was almost like a small studio. I had the manager, Nelson, so deep under my control that I didn't even want to leave. I had it made there and it had its advantages. Besides, parole was paying my rent, so I was on a free ride anyway. I got so comfortable there that I even started keeping a 38 under one of the floorboards in the bathroom. When Vicky decided to move in with me, Smokey offered to follow us in a big economy van he owned to help us move all our stuff without having to rent a U-Haul. Smokey's brother, Junior, also rode with him and helped us load everything up. When we pulled over in Santa Rosa at a liquor store, I got out of Vicky's Honda and noticed that Smokey was laid out on the back seat, sweating like a pig. As soon as I looked at him, the first thing I thought was, this fool smacked back, using heroin. I slid the van's back door open and just stood there looking at him. With a half smile, I said, yeah, fool, you're on some of that good shit, huh? He knew exactly what I was talking about and just laughed. But this would eventually open up a door later for things that we'd both become involved in. And it would start by just referring to this incident. The next time Smokey and I drove to Frisco to meet Chewy and Mo, we stopped off in San Jose and took Lencho with us. Lencho was trying to find a consistent meth supplier, so I told him I'd plug him in with Chewy and Mo. The first time we took Lencho out there, we picked up 2 pounds of crystal meth and 4 ounces of crack. I split the crystal meth with Lencho and told him how much he needed to bring back, and then Smokey and I headed back to Salinas. Meanwhile, Smokey began working with another NR member by the name of Demetrius Sonny Vasquez, who was also working with NR members William Flaco Vic from Milpitas and Salvador Kojak Cesena from San Jose. This was the same Flaco I met at Gabe's house in Salinas when Chino blasted the Golden Gate Bridge across the front of my neck. We ended up hooking up with these 3 brothers later on, and I would later get it cleared through Skip to have Flaco work directly with me. Even though Flaco was functioning in San Jose, this was a special arrangement. Sonny and Kojak were generating a lot of money for the San Jose regiment, so Skip gave me Flaco to give us a jump start and to help us turn our dope over faster. Flaco was good for about £1 a week, so he ended up being a huge asset. On one occasion when I drove out to San Jose, I called Silent on death row, Silent's wife Jennifer, and met her at her mother's house. Jennifer, who they called J-Lo, would end up becoming like a sister to me, and over the years, we developed a special bond. I would continue to stay in touch with Jennifer, and she became someone I could always depend on. Soon after Flaco started working for me, Vicky and I drove to San Francisco to visit my parents in Daly City. We tried to make it a point to see our parents at least once every week by either dropping by for a couple hours or by spending the weekend with them. On one of these occasions, when we were in San Francisco, I dropped by Chewy's house and found out that another one of my homeboys by the name of Martin Nicoyo Ocampo had just gotten out and was trying to get in touch with me. The last time I saw him was when we were in San Quentin at the adjustment center with Silent, Spanquillo, and Huevo. At that time, he was still an NR member, but Nicoya had just paroled from the Bay and had apparently been pulled as a C. I got in touch with him about a week later. We met in San Jose so I could put him in touch with Lencho. Aside from the crystal we were hooking Lencho up with, he was also moving ounces of PCP through one of Northern California's major cooks in Gilroy by the name of Eddie Birdman Bajarano. Approximately a year later, after Lencho stopped working with him, Bajarano was arrested by agents from SCCSET in what was believed to be one of the largest PCP phencyclidine operations in Santa Clara County history. In this investigation, agents, which also included Sergeant Livingston, seized an estimated $1 million worth of PCP and chemicals used in the manufacturing process. Agents called Bajarano's operation a super lab and believed that he was one of Northern California's biggest suppliers. In 4 separate storage lockers located in Morgan Hill, agents yielded 300 pounds of sodium cyanide and piperidine, which is a precursor chemical used to manufacture PCP. Bejarano would eventually cooperate with authorities, and it would later be discovered that he was actually cooking PCP for a Texas syndicate member by the name of Ruben Kalunga, who was living in Nevada. Nicoya was claiming that he had a huge dry market for it in the city and wanted to see if Lencho might be willing to put him in pocket. When I talked to Lencho about it, he said he was good with it and told me to bring him by. When we got to San Jose, I called Lencho and got the directions to his house off Astoria and Capitol. When we got to Lencho's house, it was the first time I met his girlfriend Peggy and her daughter Coco. I'd soon learned that Peggy and her daughter were both NF groupies and were the type of women who were infatuated with the lifestyle. They either knew everybody or they knew something about them. Because they had both developed somewhat of a personal relationship with Skip and Corny, they assumed they were vested with some type of special power that rendered them celebrities and almost invincible on the streets. They had an aura of arrogance about themselves, almost as if they thought they were luminaries, and every other word out of their mouths was either Skip or Corny. Skip would eventually assume the grandfather role of Coco's daughter, Monkey, and would continue to maintain steady contact with Peggy, but this wasn't devoid of a purpose. Peggy was just too blind and naive to see it for what it really was. She continues to be utilized as a conduit for his communications, and she caters to his needs by cashing her checks and keeping money on his books. To Skip, it's nothing more than a facet to his survival, to keep women like Peggy manipulated, and it's all done under the cloak of friendship. But he's only doing what he's been taught to do, as women are often the glue that holds the organization together. They receive the phone calls, they're used as visitors, they're used for mail drops, and they make sure that money is always on the books. This, in theory, keeps the wheels turning. But it's always the gullible ones like Peggy who are easily sucked into this deceptive game. Over the next couple of months, Smokey and I would drop by Lencho's house to either take him with us when we'd meet Chewy and Mo in Frisco, or when we'd all drive out to Santa Rita together to have our visitors go in and relay our communications. It was also during these times that I began to interact with Peggy and Coco much more, and would have the unfortunate experience of seeing just how much Skip and Corny involved them in our business. You'd think that these guys would learn from our past mistakes, that involving women too extensively in our affairs never ends up being a good thing. But these types of lessons are constantly ignored. I also began kicking it with Lencho more frequently whenever I drive to San Jose, but most of the time it was business related. On one occasion when I was picking up money from Lencho, we were in his truck and on our way to a 7-Eleven located off of 9th and San Carlos. We needed to pick up a few things for his homegirls who were cooking dinner for us. When I got out of the truck and went inside the store, I walked past a Samoan guy who was arguing with the cashier and appeared to be drunk. This fool was yelling at the top of his lungs and knocked over a potato chip rack. I really didn't think too much of it. When I approached the register to pay for my things, the Samoan dude said something to me, but I didn't pay him much attention since he was drunk. But when I was exiting the store, he followed me out the door and said he wanted to talk to me. I threw my bag onto the front seat and turned back towards this cat to see what he wanted. Without saying a word, he started advancing towards me and put his hand out as if to shake my hand. I didn't even give him a chance to say what he was going to say. I just socked him when he got within reach and jumped back in the truck. When I hit this fool, I knocked him out, off his feet, and watched him fall flat on his head. As soon as he hit his head, I knew he was hurt. As Lencho pulled away, I kept my eye on this guy the entire time, but he still wasn't moving. Now I was starting to worry. Not so much about hitting him, but more so because of how hard he hit his head and doing it in broad daylight. On top of that, I had to sit there and listen to Lencho chirp off about us both being on parole, that they probably got his plates, and that they had us on camera in the store. He was probably right. I honestly didn't stop to think about the cameras. As soon as we drove down the street, we had the two homegirls walk back down there to see what happened and to talk to the 7-Eleven clerk and find out if the cops asked him anything. Fortunately, this guy eventually regained consciousness and was taken away by ambulance. The clerk said the cops knew he was drunk and didn't ask anything about it. This was the last time I would see Lencho before he got busted and picked up for a sales case.